Arkansas transfer forward Maryum Dauda visited South Carolina's women's basketball program this past weekend and included them in her final two. But the bigger story here isn't just about her visit.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also the lead publisher for Gamecock Digest over on Fan Nation. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team here today. We are free and available both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more right now as new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Happy Tuesday, Gamecock Nation, and I hope that you all had a great Memorial Day weekend. And as always, God bless those who paid the ultimate sacrifice for us to enjoy the freedoms that we have here in our country and also the loved ones that they have left behind. We got a lot to talk about on today's edition of Locked On Gamecocks. We're going to talk a good bit about baseball later on in the show. We'll talk about why the Raleigh Regional is a winnable regional for South Carolina's baseball team. And also, did Mark Kingston move the needle at all regarding his potential job security after the little mini run the Gamecocks went on in Hoover in the SEC baseball tournament? We'll dive into all that later in the show. But we're going to start off today's show with an interesting transfer portal development that has taken place on the women's basketball front as Dawn Staley and the Gamecocks hosted Arkansas transfer forward Maryum Dauda this past weekend. But the biggest takeaway from this development goes beyond just the actual visit itself. Now, Maryum Dauda, she posted a video on her TikTok account this past weekend of her in a South Carolina uniform and doing a little dance alongside Raven Johnson and Adele Tack. So that was how this story began to gain some traction. And then subsequently, 94 Feet Women's Basketball, a prominent women's basketball account on X, they subsequently reported that Dauda is down to two schools, South Carolina and Baylor, and she's going to make her decision later on this week. Now, we've talked about Maryum Dauda before on this show, but to give y'all a brief recap, Dauda, she started every single game for the Arkansas Razorbacks this past season, her redshirt sophomore season. She averaged 10.1 points, 6.3 rebounds, and 2.24 blocks per game, which ended up being right around 74 blocks in 33 games. That was the third best mark in the SEC behind only Camila Cardoso and Ashlyn Watkins. Dauda also averaged 31.9% from three-point range in terms of shooting the basketball on 91 shots from behind the arc this past winter, which is something that differentiates her from a lot of other players in the front court on South Carolina's roster and just generally speaking in women's college basketball. And that is where I want to take this conversation. I talked about on the other show where we talked about Maryum Dauda how her three-point shooting ability could help South Carolina, how it could sort of change the makeup of their offense. And that is where I want to go with this because South Carolina, as we talked about before, in the past, this was a team that was predominantly a half-court offense, essentially swing the ball around the perimeter and take advantage of the overwhelming length and height that you had in your front court, throw the ball down the low block, and just let them go to work. Last season, of course, things changed for South Carolina. South Carolina became more of an up-tempo, fast-paced transition type offense thanks to Raven Johnson and Mylasia Fulwiley. Those two players obviously have a massive impact in the offensive sort of change that we saw this past season. But the fact that Maryum Dauda has been hosted for a visit by South Carolina, one, it obviously conveys that the Gamecocks are heavily interested in bringing Dauda into this locker room and into this program, but at the same time, this also indicates that Dawn Staley is willing to change how South Carolina attacks offensively speaking. Now, does this mean that South Carolina is no longer going to throw the ball down the low block and they're basically just going to become a three-point shooting team only? No, it does not mean that, obviously. But with Maryum Dauda and the different things that she could do offensively compared to what South Carolina Gamecock fans have seen in the past few years, it is fair to say that this is a sign that South Carolina is willing to, once again, adapt to the personnel that they have right now, or they might be getting ready to get here in the next week or two. So, what does this say about Dawn Staley? Well, it tells you why she is currently the best coach in all of women's college basketball. Dawn Staley is willing to change. Obviously, 2017, South Carolina went on a massive run in that tournament, knocked off Mississippi State in the national title game to win their first title. Then, a couple years ago, thanks in large part to Aaliyah Boston and other players like Zia Cook and Bree Beal, and obviously Destiny Henderson, they knocked off the UConn Huskies in the 2022 national title game. They seemed destined to win another title in 2023, but then, of course, as we all remember, they lost to Iowa in the Final Four. And that was when there was a massive question asked of Dawn Staley, and that was, is she going to change some things with this basketball team? Because a big reason I should say, that South Carolina arguably lost that game to Caitlin Clark in Iowa was because, quite frankly, they lacked perimeter shooting threats. The only one they really had on that team that season was Zia Cook. And yes, Bree Beal had made massive strides in that regard in her final year in a Gamecock uniform, but it wasn't exactly reassuring that it came down to only really those two players, and behind them, there wasn't much else to speak of in terms of three-point shooting. And obviously, that changed this past season. Dawn Staley went out and grabbed Oregon transfer Tahina Paopao, who obviously changed this team tremendously in that one aspect, but she also brought in Malaysia Fulwiley, who, as the season progressed, got much better and much more efficient in terms for three-point shooting. Raven Johnson became a better three-point shooter. Tessa Johnson, another true freshman, came in, and although obviously it's a rainbow shot, hey, who cares? It went in over 40% of the time she put one up. And so this team became much more dangerous because not only did you not have to worry about them in the front court, but you also don't have to worry about them behind the three-point line. And with Camila Cardoso now gone, and there not being maybe a just bona fide successor behind her. Again, that's not to say that there isn't talent in the front court. Yes, you've got Sanaya Fagan, you've got an Adele Tack, you've got an Ashlyn Watkins, and I'm sure that collectively they can fill in that void quite well. But there's not going to be that dominant interior presence that South Carolina's been used to having over the past 4 or 5 years. They're not going to have that, at least offensively speaking, more than likely this next season. And so, a Maryum Dauda, who averaged, again, 10 points, 6.3 rebounds, is going to give you good numbers. But the fact that she has the added dimension of being able to shoot from behind the three-point line, this tells me that Dawn Staley, she sees the way the roster currently looks, and she's sitting there going, if I can add her, and it means we've got to change things a little bit more offensively for the second year in a row, I'm okay with that. You saw how well it worked out for them this past year. They went undefeated. Arguably, wound up being a better team, collectively speaking, overall, than the previous team was in 2022 and 23, the final year that the freshies were in town. So, this says a lot about how Dawn Staley is willing to change her philosophy and how she's willing to adapt. And it tells you, above all else, why, again, currently, she's the best coach in this sport. Why South Carolina subsequently is the best team in the sport right now. So again, keep an eye out on Maryum Dauda. Apparently supposed to announce a decision later this week. I think it'd be a pretty big get for South Carolina if they land her at the end of the day. Now, South Carolina's baseball team, they are currently in the midst of the postseason. They won a nice little run in Hoover in the SEC tournament this past week, but the question coming out of that tournament, besides the fielding issues that they have, is Where does this leave Mark Kingston? Does this change things regarding the perception surrounding his job security? Or is South Carolina going to have to do a little bit more if Mark Kingston wants to come back for at least one more season here in Columbia? We'll talk about that in a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. I gotta be honest with y'all, I'm stunned with how the Western Conference Finals is going on right now in the NBA playoffs. The Dallas Mavericks have a 3-0 lead over the Minnesota Timberwolves, who knocked out the Denver Nuggets, the defending NBA champs, in the past round. So, the game is taking place, game 4 I should say, later tonight at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and currently the Mavericks are a 1.5 point favorite according to the odds makers at FanDuel. Do you think the Mavericks will pull off the sweep in their home arena, or do you think that Anthony Edwards will have something else to say about that? No matter what you think, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first choice for South Carolina Gamecock sports coverage. All right, let's talk a little bit of baseball now here with South Carolina, as the Gamecocks made it all the way to the semifinals in Hoover this past week. And although it was a relatively successful stay at the SEC baseball tournament, I gotta tell y'all, I don't believe that this moved the needle much as far as Mark Kingston's job security is concerned. Now, before we get to the job security part of this conversation and what Mark Kingston has to do in order to keep his job, I do want to put this out there. I think that it was really good to see how hard this team fought this past week against a litany of really good teams. Alabama, Arkansas, Kentucky, LSU on 2 different occasions. Needless to say, this team has not quit. And that means, therefore, Mark Kingston has not lost the locker room. Because obviously, when you lose the locker room, when you lose the players, it's pretty easy to see it when they're out there on the field. And look, this team defeated 2 teams that earned top 8 national seeds for the NCAA tournament in Kentucky and Arkansas. And they defeated another regional team in Alabama. So they did a lot of good things this past week. Now, what I will say in conjunction with that is this. Those performances do not completely wipe away what all has happened before this point. And that includes losing your only 2 games you played against Clemson by 1 run in both contests. Losing a series on the road against the Ole Miss Rebels, a team that did not make the NCAA tournament and was the number 12 seed, basically the last team to qualify for the SEC baseball tournament. That says a lot. They also won only 2 of their 6 home series against top 25 teams. Now, to be fair, you could say, well, they were all practically maybe top 10 teams, not just top 25, having to play Arkansas, Texas A&M, Kentucky, you name it. But you still only won 2 of those 6 series. Founders Park is supposed to be a dangerous place to play. And I know that some people might say, well, you got to put down the fans. I would turn around and say, you want the fans to show up in full force, give them reason to do so. And this team just did not do that really this season. And of course, they ended the regular season on a 6-game losing skid, losing each of their games against Georgia, all at home, by the way, and at Tennessee on the road, which admittedly, I think a lot of fans, including myself, expected. So, getting all that out of the way now, the last question people are going to be left asking here is, what exactly does Mark Kingston have to do to keep his job? I would say that, look, some people have said it's going to take him going to Omaha to keep his job. I think that that's a little bit of a stretch. I don't think that he has to make it to the College World Series to keep his job. Obviously, if they did, then yeah, it's a outright guarantee. Mark Kingston would be back for another season. But I think if Mark Kingston wants to keep his job, this team that he currently has got to make it to the Super Regional round. If they get bounced in Raleigh, and we'll talk about that Raleigh region a little bit more here in a few minutes, but if they get bounced there, I would say that it is fair to assume that Mark Kingston would not be back next season. Now, I, again, don't have any sources that have verified that. It's purely a gut feeling, but it is definitely easy to see why fans are frustrated considering the expectations that this team had coming into this year. And quite frankly, the players you're going to be losing after this season. You're going to lose a lot of firepower off of this team, both in terms of your pitching staff and especially in terms of leadership, with Cole Messina being a draft-eligible junior, likely heading on to the minor leagues after this season is over. And so you've got to make something happen here and now. If you don't, and this season ends on a sour note, then listen, we don't even know if the guys that could come back are going to come back because of the fact that you're now in an era where players can leave right now at any time, really, that they want to after a season's conclusion. That means a guy like Ethan Petrie, if he decides that, hey, I've got more in the tank here and I feel like this staff isn't getting the most out of me, I need to go somewhere else. He could leave after this year. And then what do you have left in the batting lineup in terms of power hitting, in terms of a game-changing hitter? You don't really have a whole lot to speak of. So it is very important, in my opinion, for Mark Kingston to make it to the Super Regionals. And by the way, ironically enough, if South Carolina were to get out of that Raleigh Regional, they would likely, in terms of probabilities, they would be facing the number 7 national seed in the Georgia Bulldogs in Athens. So it would be a massive revenge opportunity for the Gamecocks as well. But again, that's if you get out of Raleigh. However, I do believe that this is a very winnable regional for South Carolina. And quite frankly, I think they got a pretty good draw. I'll talk about the reasons why I believe this in just a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in 30 minutes or less. All right, let's talk about the Raleigh Regional for South Carolina. Not going to go super in-depth quite yet. Obviously, the Gamecocks will not play until Friday afternoon when they take on the number 3 seed in the James Madison Dukes. However, looking at this regional from a bird's eye view, this is a very winnable regional for South Carolina. Now, sometimes you've got regionals where literally you could sit there and see all 4 teams potentially winning it. However, just to make it clear, I don't think that's the case with this regional. Look, credit to the Bryant Bulldogs for making it to the NCAA tournament. Obviously, teams that are in those kind of conferences, they have to scrap and fight really hard to earn a spot. As College of Charleston found out the very hard way on Monday afternoon. It's a crime, by the way, they did not make it, as a side note. But Bryant, when you look at their quad 1 and quad 2 games based on RPI that they played this season, they are 1-8 in quad 1 and quad 2 games. So just looking at it from that standpoint, I'm going to leave Bryant out of this conversation moving forward. The 2 main competitors for South Carolina in this regional are the 1 and 3 seeds in NC State and James Madison. And when you compare South Carolina's numbers to those 2 teams, they've got an advantage, statistically speaking. And where does that advantage lie? You might be surprised. The advantage lies in the pitching numbers. South Carolina's team ERA heading into the NCAA tournament is 5.08. The next closest ERA overall is James Madison at 6.01. NC State, if you're wondering, their ERA, I believe, is 6.38 or 6.39. Not really good for a team that got a number 10 national seed out of the ACC conference. So South Carolina, they give up on average around 1 less run per game compared to James Madison and NC State. Now, you look at runs scored per game. We're going to keep this simple for today's show. South Carolina averages 7.6 runs scored per contest. NC State averages 7.7, and James Madison averages 7.5. So offensively speaking, if you just look at the numbers on paper, all three of these offenses are about dead even in terms of how much they score in terms of runs. So the differentiating factor, I should say, in this tournament, in this regional, is likely going to be which team does best on the mound. Does South Carolina's pitching staff have a weekend like they had against Georgia, where, quite frankly, they could not stop anybody that weekend? Or do they do what they did this past week in Hoover, and do they step up when they are needed? And that was the great part about this run in Hoover, is that Mark Kingston and this coaching staff, they saw multiple pitchers step up. Some guys maybe that had a bit of a down year compared to years past. And other guys that, quite frankly, maybe up till this past week, fans nor coaches probably had a lot of trust in these players. But you saw Chris Veach go out there and just pitch a gem against Alabama in the first round. You saw Parker Marlott and Matthew Becker have great closeout performances against the Kentucky Wildcats in an elimination game this past Friday. You saw Ty Good go out there and have a great game against Arkansas in the second round. Sam Simpson had a pretty solid outing against LSU in game number 2 that they played in that semifinal round this past Saturday. Sam Simpson, I believe, only had 3 appearances all season long before that game. And that's not to say Sam Simpson is all of a sudden going to be one of your top relievers, but the point is he got through almost 2 whole innings and didn't give up, I think, any damage against LSU. So you've got a pitching staff now where it's like, okay, we got a little bit more belief in this group of guys than maybe we had going into the SEC tournament. Great sign. Compared that to NC State and James Madison. And look, when it comes to postseason baseball, obviously everybody wants to have great offenses. That's pretty much the name of the game now across all sports, football, baseball, and basketball. But I am still a believer that if you're going to win, and you're going to win a lot in postseason baseball, you've got to have great fielding. You've got to have clutch situational hitting. You don't need to hit all the home runs that you need to in the world, but when you got runners on second and third with 1 out, how many runs do you bring in? Do you bring any of them in? And do you have great pitching? That is what decides how far you go in the postseason. South Carolina's pitching staff, I don't think anyone's going to sit here and say it's a great pitching staff. Maybe not even a good pitching staff, but it's a pitching staff that, hey, if enough guys step up, if their stars show up, and then some other guys behind them can step up to the mound when they need to, then hey, I think that this is a staff where you've got enough complementary pieces where can you get out of at least the regional round? I think the answer here is yes. So am I going to say that this means they're going to go to Omaha? No. But I absolutely could see South Carolina being the team that gets out of Raleigh and moves on to the super regional round to face Georgia or any of the other teams that they've got in their regional. And the great news, by the way, with how this bracket is set up, think about this. South Carolina is the number 2 seed in NC State's regional. NC State was the number 10 overall national seed. What that means is this. South Carolina, first of all, in terms of the final bracket, they were 7 spots away from being a national seed and hosting a regional, which is kind of crazy to think about. But the reason why that's important is because of this. If South Carolina were to win the Raleigh regional, and then Georgia, let's say the pitching just does not do any better against the lower level competition that they face, and they get bounced. If that happens, guess what? All of a sudden, South Carolina is hosting the super regionals in Columbia, with a chance to go to Omaha if you just win 2 out of 3 games. And that is it. Wouldn't that be some kind of turnaround after what we saw from this team in the last 2 weeks of the regular season? So the point here is this. There's a chance for this team to go on a run. Yes, certain things are going to have to bounce their way, but there is a path to a run taking place. So, with all that being said, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. Hope that y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show as always. What are your thoughts on Maryum Dauda visiting South Carolina and what this says about Dawn Staley's willingness to potentially change South Carolina's offense even more heading into next season? What are your thoughts on Mark Kingston's job security right now? Do you think he's safe, or do you think he needs to go deep in the postseason to come back from one more season? And lastly, what are your thoughts on the Raleigh Regional as a whole? Do you think this is a winnable regional for the Gamecocks? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section if you watch today's show on YouTube, or you can shoot me a direct message on X at @A_SC if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app. As always, thank y'all so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Tuesday, and I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.